Airmen versus Headhunters. While conducting an air attack against a group of Imperial Japanese Navy warships stationed at Brunei Bay, Borneo, a consolidated B-24 Liberator under Lieutenant Tom Coberly's command was shot down by a direct hit from an anti-aircraft shell. The survivors ventured into the jungle and met the Dayaks, a savage tribe known to be headhunters. The soldiers advanced into the tribe's village, but their host's reception was unexpected. The event occurred as air combat intensified in the Pacific in 1944. The B-24 undertaking the attack was carrying men from the 23rd Bomb Squadron, 307th Bomb Group. After it was hit, the bomber burst into flames. Co-pilot Lieutenant Jerry Rosenthal took control of the aircraft, while the rest of the crew parachuted into the unknown. Lieutenant Coberly did not survive the parachute jump, while Rosenthal perished during the crash. Only 8 men survived. Equipped with nothing more than a few handguns and knives, the soldiers advanced into the jungle looking for food and shelter while they waited to be rescued. They did not know that they had landed in a territory where ancient tribesmen were used to headhunting and decorating their homes with their trophies as a display of force. It was the land of the Dayaks. When the American airmen arrived at the natives' village, they found that the Dayaks had been Christianized by American missionaries. But the evangelists had been attacked by Japanese forces, and the Dayaks were wary of outsiders. While the American soldiers waited for rescue, District Officer William Makahanap of the Dutch Colonial Administration helped them deceive the Japanese garrison and get rid of their patrols. Makahanap was a Japanese-appointed official, but he opted to help the Americans survive given the state of the war. Days later, British Major Tom Harrison of Special Operations Summit 1 parachuted into the zone and helped convert the Dayaks into a guerrilla force against the Japanese. With the help of 8 men, Harrison trained the Dayaks and began building an improvised airfield so that aircraft could land to extract the wounded U.S. airmen. A rice paddy was drained using primitive and improvised tools, and a simple bamboo deck was installed. While Harrison and the Dayaks fought the Japanese units in the zone, a squadron of Australian Oster liaison aircraft began carrying the U.S. airmen back to safety one at a time. This encounter was one of many similar events in which Western soldiers had contact with native people of Asia and trained them to become fighting forces against the Japanese garrisons scattered all over the continent and its islands. Nazis and Americans fight together. The Battle of Castle Itter is the only known World War II encounter in which American and German forces fought together against Nazi SS protection squadrons. It took place on May 5, 1945, in the village of Itter, in the Austrian North Tyrol, days after Berlin had surrendered. The Castle of Itter dates back to the Feudal Age. In 1940, it was leased by the Germans from its owner to use as a prison for high-profile French prisoners. In February 1943, it was requisitioned by the Wehrmacht armed forces and became known as an Evakuierungslager, or evacuation camp. Under direct orders of Heinrich Himmler, the supreme leader of the SS, high-value prisoners of several nationalities, especially French, were transferred to the castle. Itter was then put under the operational control of the Dachau concentration camp, which was just 90 miles to the northwest. By early 1945, Germany's defeat was imminent. The U.S. Totenkopf officers began to flee the castle, leaving the French prisoners behind to fend for themselves. The French then stormed the armory and picked up as many weapons and as much ammunition as they could. The prisoners were ready to flee Itter, but there was a problem. The surrounding area was filled with Waffen SS soldiers. Electrician Zvonimir Kukovic, a member of the Yugoslav Communist Resistance, volunteered to go and find Allied troops that could help with their liberation. Kukovic eventually found a surrendered group of Wehrmacht soldiers. Its major, Josef Sepp Gangl, directed him to recently taken Innsbruck, where he could find a U.S. garrison. Gangl and some of his men also jumped into the truck, hoping to improve their survival chances by joining the victorious Americans. Halfway through the journey, the men encountered elements of the 103rd Infantry Division. After putting a plan together, they raced back to Castle Itter, meeting plenty of enemy fire along the way. Major Gangl, carrying a huge white flag, retold the Castle Itter story to Allied commands. First Lieutenant Jack Lee volunteered to lead the mission, taking 2 Sherman tanks, 14 U.S. soldiers, and 10 former German artillerymen. When they reached the secluded castle, Lee and Gangl were received by the political prisoners. They were not expecting a group of American and German soldiers working together. Lieutenant Lee and Major Gangl were informed that more than 100 Waffen SS soldiers guarded the zone and could attack any minute. The small force decided to occupy the castle and wait for reinforcements. Within minutes, a fierce battle began. Fire from the tree line surrounding the castle hit Major Gangl and some Wehrmacht soldiers. An 88mm anti-tank gun then blew apart one of the American tanks, and the SS troops began to advance. The small German-American force was running out of men and ammunition when a relief column arrived and put an end to the siege. Lieutenant Lee was soon promoted to captain, and before he passed almost 3 decades later, he would say about the joint battle, quote, "Well, it was just the damnedest thing." Britain versus France. In June 1940, France surrendered to the Third Reich after their efforts proved ineffective against the innovative tactics of the German Blitzkrieg doctrine. France and Germany then signed a relatively benevolent and surprising agreement. France expected to be punished severely for the harsh penalties imposed on the Germans with the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. Instead, they were allowed to keep their military intact as long as it remained in French-controlled territory. Great Britain immediately declared that Marshal Philippe Pétain violated the accord that France had with Britain regarding a no-separate peace agreement with Germany. With Germany and France at peace, the British Empire feared that the Axis could use the French maritime fleet to strengthen its own and dominate the sea. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was unwilling to put the world's 4th largest fleet into Germany's hands. Churchill ordered all French vessels to set sail to any British port still standing, but Pétain, now head of the Vichy regime, refused. He was not willing to risk the peace treaty he had just signed with the Germans and anger Hitler. Churchill and the War Cabinet grew irritated and decided to take action. On July 3rd, they ordered that every French vessel within Britain's grasp that did not surrender to English warships would be destroyed. The mission was called Operation Catapult. One of the mission's key objectives was to seize or destroy the French fleet stationed at Mers el-Kabir in North Africa. The Algerian port was home to 7 destroyers, 4 submarines, and several torpedo boats heavily protected by shore batteries. The fleet was under the control of Admiral Marcel Jean Soult. British Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville was tasked with presenting Admiral Jean Soult with 4 alternatives: to have his fleet join the Royal Navy, to take the fleet to any British port with minimal crews, to take the fleet to an American or French West Indian port and be decommissioned, or to be sunk by the British Royal Navy at the African port. On July 3rd, Somerville arrived at Mers el-Kabir to parley with Jean Soult. Looking at the British warships approaching on the horizon, the Frenchman felt insulted with what he considered British diplomacy at gunpoint. After failed attempts to reach an agreement, Jean Soult got ready for combat. Meanwhile, the British mined the harbor and opened fire without hesitation. It was the first time as far back as the early 19th century that France and Britain engaged in naval combat. Most of the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir was destroyed. They had no time to retaliate. More than 1,200 French sailors lost their lives. Although France was enraged after the attack, Marshal Pétain did not retaliate. Prime Minister Churchill was pleased with the outcome. In the span of a few hours, France's naval force had been reduced to 20% of its capacity. The danger of a reinforced Axis fleet had been eliminated. America versus nobody. A strange occurrence took place during the Japanese occupation of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska between 1942 and 1943. American and Canadian forces organized Operation Cottage to recapture Kiska Island in August of 1943. U.S. forces of the 7th Infantry Division and Canadians of the 13th Infantry Brigade, along with the Joint 1st Special Service Force, landed on opposite shores of Kiska Island to overwhelm the Japanese garrison and encircle them. Over 34,000 soldiers and nearly 100 Allied warships had been summoned. Nobody knew that the Japanese had retreated from the island 2 weeks earlier, after the Japanese Imperial Army decided that it was no longer defensible. Amidst the confusion and thick fog, American and Canadian forces mistook each other and engaged in a friendly fire shootout. The raid lasted 2 days. Along with mines, bombs, accidental detonations, transport accidents, and booby traps, the unprecedented intelligence and coordination mishap left over 300 casualties. It was a tragic outcome triggered by a deserted island. Dentists go to war. 2 bored men from the British Dental Corps were eager to leave their posts and join the fight against the Germans in 1942. When their request to be transferred to regular army units was denied, Sergeant Peter King and Private Thomas Leslie Cuthbertson decided to take it to the next level. Both men amassed rifles, grenades, and ammunition from their local armory and deserted from their positions to carry out their own special operations missions in German-controlled France. Before leaving England, they sent Prime Minister Winston Churchill a detailed letter of their operation. Once in France, they carried out sabotage missions until the Germans tried to capture them. They then made their way back to England, but their boat ran out of fuel on the way back. When they were rescued, the army sent them to prison for a month. Still, after demonstrating their bravery, King and Cuthbertson were later assigned to a regular army unit and fought until the end of the war.